It is an indisputable fact that in the multi-millennia-long fictional history of Star Wars, Darth Bane is the most important Sith Lord, period. No one else compares in significance to him. Revan, Exar Kun, Nagasato, Krayt, these were all just warlords with armies and space magic. And those things didn't exactly help them all that much in the end, now did they? Even Sidious, the first Sith Lord to actually succeed in taking over the galaxy, was the beneficiary of Darth Bane. Without Bane, there is no Rule of Two. Without the Rule of Two, the Sith just keep popping up in these mobs that will eventually turn on one another and so give the Jedi the opening to finally beat them in the end. Darth Krayt tried to wallpaper over this with his whole Rule of One, but really he was just turning his back on the Rule of Two and returning to the old failed system that had served the Sith so poorly for so many millennia. Bane is a crucial character, and so it is only fitting that such a character have a story of his own. And while Timothy Zahn's original Thrawn trilogy will always be number one in terms of books, in my possibly biased opinion, Drew Karpyshyn's trilogy about Darth Bane is a strong contender for number two, possibly even the strongest. These three books are far more deserving of being canon on their own than all of the High Republic put together. And so, let's talk about why that is. And so, we first start at the beginning, because before he was Darth Bane, before he was even plain Bane, he was Dessel. His friends called him Des, or at least they would have if he had any friends. He was born on the Outer Rim mining world of Apatros, or Apatros. However you pronounce the name, it was about as miserable a ball of rock as it was possible to live on in a galaxy far, far away. Unfortunately, this miserable ball of rock had something very, very valuable. Cortosis, one of the few substances in Star Wars that is resistant to lightsabers. And given that this was in the final decades of the new Sith Wars, it stands to reason that the Republic would want to get as much of that stuff as it could. Enter Outer Rim Ore Works, your very standard, greedy, amoral shading into immoral corporation. Not only is Cortosis mining backbreaking work in itself, after all, as a substance immune to energy, Cortosis can only be mined by literally jackhammering it to tiny bits. Never mind all the other myriad hazards of mine work, including exposure to toxic substances that make sure no one has hair on Apatros. But Oro, operating in the Outer Rim with almost no oversight, employs myriad slimy ways to essentially keep its employees in a permanent state of debt peonage to the company. It provides company housing, but the rents are obscenely high. It will loan money to its employees so that they can purchase food and other necessities, but also expects them to pay back that loan with high interest. What's more, since Oro effectively owned Apatros as a kind of planet-wide company town, it is illegal for any employee of the company to leave the world without first paying off all their debts. And as I've just established, Oro did everything in its power to make it almost impossible for any of its employees to do that. Being born into a life like that would have been bad enough for Dessel. But just to add two final rotten cherries atop the turd sundae that was his life, his mother died giving birth to him, and his alcoholic father Hurst blamed him for it, verbally and even physically abusing Dessel ever since he was a toddler, often referring to his own son as the bane of his existence, for he also blamed the boy for his miserable circumstances on Apatros, right up until the day that Hurst died in his sleep of a massive heart attack a few years prior to the beginning of the story. In some ways, his father's death did make life easier for Dessel. In others, it did not, as according to Oro company policy, Dessel ended up inheriting most of his father's debts. What's more, Hurst had a lot of friends among the older miners who decided to take it upon themselves to pick up where their comrade had left off, that is to say, abusing Dessel. It was only after, thanks in part to all those hard years in the mines, Dessel grew big and strong enough to kick their asses that they started leaving him alone. By that point, Dessel had grown into a sullen, brooding man. His was not a nature predisposed toward forming friendships. And yet, despite all the hard knocks that life had given him, Dessel was convinced that he was not destined to end his days on Apatros. Some other, grander fate awaited him in the stars beyond. He didn't know how he knew, he just knew with iron certainty. That destiny finally came knocking in the year 1003 BBY, in the final years of the new Sith Wars. Dessel was 23. For a day of destiny, it did not begin auspiciously. That day, Gerd, one of Dessel's father's old cronies, decided to pick a fight with him near the end of Dessel's shift. Despite Dessel being younger and stronger than him, the older miner had gotten drunk enough to think he could pick a fight, and cunning enough to wait until near the end of Dessel's shift when he would be exhausted from hours of jackhammering away at Cortosis. Dessel still won the fight in the end, partly thanks to some natural, if untrained, force sensitivity allowing him to anticipate Gerd's moves. In the end, he bit off the older miner's thumb, but in fairness, Gerd was trying to gouge his eye out at the time. A severed thumb was easily remedied. Oro did have the technology, and after all, by providing such medical service, Gerd would now owe them more money. Even so, Dessel was ordered off the worksite, which meant an incomplete shift, which meant that much fewer credits to pay off his debt to Oro. But when he learned that there was a new Republic vessel docking at the only port city on Apatros, Dessel decided that maybe he could turn this unlucky day around by fleecing a few Republic soldiers of their credits. And so he went on over to Apatros's one and only cantina and gaming establishment, run by a Neimoidian named Groshik, who was the closest thing Dessel had to a friend, in the sense that he was the only being on the planet that regarded him without hostility or suspicion like the other miners did. Just as Dessel had hoped, there were indeed some Republic soldiers at the sabacc table. Even better, some of them were the kind of person with more credits than sense. If you want more detail, check out my video on Rebel Dawn, but essentially sabacc is the Star Wars equivalent of blackjack. There are two pots into which every player must ante up in every hand: the hand pot and the sabacc pot. The hand pot goes to whoever has the best hand that particular round. You only win the sabacc pot if you get one of three special winning hands: a positive or a negative 23, called a pure sabacc, or the Idiot's Array, a hand with a 2, a 3, and the Idiot card, Star Wars version of the Joker. Of course, the Republic soldiers weren't just there to play cards and stock up on Cortosis. A few of the more senior officers at the card table actually tried to recruit Bane for the Republic Army. They read him the usual spiel: fighting for truth and justice, protecting the weak, excitement and adventure, but Bane wanted none of it. You see, if he or any of the other miners were to join the Republic, they would still owe their debt to Oro, which meant that any pay they received as soldiers would first go to paying off the immense debt they owed to the mining company, which meant that they would just be trading one deadly dangerous job with almost no pay for another. By contrast, the Sith didn't give a Minox fart about that sort of thing, and for that reason alone, though the average Apatrosian was apolitical, if you were to put a blaster to his head, he would more likely lean Sithward. As for Dessel himself, his hard upbringing had essentially made him something of a social Darwinist. After all, it was only after he'd gotten strong enough to beat up those that tried to beat on him that he had any kind of peace on Apatros. To his way of thinking, it was only natural that the strong should rule over the weak. Equality is nothing more than a mythology and a crutch for weaklings to cling to. He said all of this in a very brazen way, partly to get the Republic officers to stop trying to recruit him, but also to provoke them. After all, angry card players are more likely to make mistakes. Long story short, the game went on for several hours. Players coming and going until at last all that was left was Dessel and one of the Republic ensigns, both playing for an especially massive sabacc pot. The ensign, drunk and possessed of very deep pockets, was stung by Dessel's comments about the Republic and the Sith, and had stayed in the game for no other reason than to take the smug miner down a peg. And as the game dragged on, Dessel began to doubt himself. He'd been certain when he'd walked into the cantina that he was going to win. What he'd called his instincts had never been wrong before. Then again, there's always a first time. But no, the Force was indeed with him. And in the last hand of the game, both men drew the Idiot's Array, which now meant, under house rules, the house being Oro, the two card players entered essentially a sudden death mode. Unless one of them pulled out either a pure sabacc or another Idiot's Array, all of the money in the sabacc pot would go to the house. It was one of many ways that Oro made sure that none of the miners could suddenly pay off their debts with a big win at the gambling table. But once again, the Force was with Dessel, and incredibly, he pulled a pure sabacc. The ensign, thoroughly sauced and utterly pissed off, accused Dessel of cheating and then accused the miners of being treacherous Sith scum, heaping all manner of insults on them, completely unaware of the fact that it was just him and two of his cronies against several dozen pissed-off men. Men that would have gleefully torn them all to pieces if Groshek hadn't pulled a stun gun and threatened to put everyone down for the night. Unusually brave behavior for a Neimoidian. Groshek closed the canteen early and sent everyone but Dessel home. After cleaning up the place, the two men sat at the bar for a few glasses of brandy, and to Dessel's surprise, Groshek seemed to imply that the human had unusual abilities. During the whole card game, it hadn't been just Dessel's words baiting the Republic soldiers like the ensign. It had seemed to Groshek as if Dessel had been radiating an aura that inflamed the anger of everyone within the vicinity. Even the bartender himself had felt it, all the way at the other end of the cantina. It was the first time anyone had ever suggested to Dessel that maybe he had a connection to the Force. But the young miner dismissed the idea. To his mind, the kind of powers that were often said to be possessed by the Jedi and Sith were nothing more than fairy tales, or at best, gross exaggerations. In the end, Groshek sent Dessel on his way back home to his cubicle once he believed that enough time had elapsed. But it turned out, Dessel was waylaid anyway in the dark streets of Apatros. Despite being outnumbered and taken by surprise, Dessel's force-driven instinct served him well, and so when one of his assailants came at him with a vibroknife, he simply turned the weapon back on its user. At which point, presumably for dramatic effect, the streetlights came back on, and it was indeed the three Republic troopers, although only two now, as the ensign lay bleeding out on the street, killed by his own vibroknife. The other two soldiers ran off, and Dessel knew he was screwed. There was simply no way to cover up what had happened. It would be the Republic military holding the tribunal, and it would be his word against theirs. Not knowing what else to do, he ran back to the cantina and asked Groshek for help. Luckily, like Muscle Man from regular show, Groshek was the kind of guy who knew people. People that could get Dessel off-world. Thing is, these people were recruiters for the Sith. The only way Dessel was getting off Apatros was if he chose to enroll in their army. Not having much of a choice in the matter, Dessel agreed. Filled with gratitude, the young miner promised to repay the debt he owed Groshek if he ever got the chance, but the Neimoidian waved it away, certain the two would never meet again. But he did pass on to Dessel one last piece of advice. In the end, never count on others. When it comes down to it, you are the only person you can rely on. And so, the big muscular miner found himself cramped in a hidden smuggling space aboard a cargo ship departing Apatros that night. It wasn't quite how he'd expected it, but he was finally leaving Apatros after all those years. His destiny among the stars awaited him. A bit of context. Around the time that Dessel departed from Apatros to join the armies of the Sith was the final stage of what became known as the Republic Dark Age. See, the new Sith Wars had gone on for 1,000 years at this point, with the Sith controlling the Outer and Mid-Rim and the Republic cowering behind its borders. However, the tide was shifting. The Republic and the Jedi were finding their spines again. And the Sith, as was their habit, had ceased to be a united force, divided into small empires and petty kingdoms. This is the setting of the Knight Errant series if you want to check out my videos on that. In fact, Knight Errant takes place only a few decades before the Darth Bane trilogy. At any rate, against a united and newly emboldened Republic and Jedi Order, the various Sith despots and petty tyrants had no chance. Then salvation came in a most unlikely form, that of a recently fallen former Jedi named Shere Khan. And yes, that is a direct reference to the Jungle Book, specifically the Disney version, which means that by rights the man should sound like George Sanders.
I thought perhaps you were entertaining someone up there in your coils.
Through a combination of charisma and subtle mental manipulation, Khan managed to unite most of the Sith behind him in the Brotherhood of Darkness. Those few who chose to resist him, he destroyed. But Force users, whether light or dark side aligned, are thin on the ground at the best of times. And so while the Brotherhood of Darkness was in charge of things, the bulk of the Sith army was comprised of ordinary men and women, either people who had just grown up their entire lives under Sith rule, or people who felt disenchanted with the Republic and its purported promises of justice, as well as other sundry mercenaries, criminals, and fugitives like Dessel. Of course, being a young man in the prime of his life, and physically fit after all those years of mining, Dessel made for a natural soldier, and his latent Force sensitivity, although he still didn't know what it was or how to control it, made him an excellent leader. At first, the unit Dessel was assigned to, the Gloomwalkers, were just one of many expendable frontline units for the Sith army, commanded by a marginally competent man named Lieutenant Ulabor. However, thanks to Dessel, and especially his gift, the fortune of the Gloomwalkers changed. Dessel first saw action when the Sith decided to try and take over Kashyyyk, the Wookiee homeworld. The initial Sith attempt to take over the planet was a disaster. The Republic forces, with the help of Wookiee guides, launched a guerrilla campaign that essentially cut the first wave of the Sith invasion to pieces. The Gloomwalkers were sent in with the second wave, which proved no more successful than the first. And in the chaos, the Gloomwalkers were cut off from the rest of the army. While Ulabor panicked, not knowing what to do, Dessel stepped up to save the Gloomwalkers from the Gundark pit they were stuck in. For 3 days and nights, the Gloomwalkers snuck through the predator-infested forests, Dessel's Force sensitivity allowing him to detect and avoid enemy units and Republic traps. They still had to fight quite a few pitched battles, and many Gloomwalkers died, but the bulk of the unit did manage to reconnect with the Sith army. The fact that they'd survived where so many had not made the Gloomwalkers a rallying point for the Sith, and after Kashyyyk was eventually captured, Ulabor was given special commendation as the unit's commander. He never gave Dessel any credit for the Gloomwalkers' survival, but he did promote Dessel to sergeant, and so an unspoken understanding was reached between the two men. Whenever the unit was sent into an action, Ulabor would always get the credit afterwards, but he would always make sure to listen to his sergeant's advice and trust his instincts. With Dessel as their secret sauce, even in campaigns where the Sith were beaten, the Gloomwalkers went from strength to strength, transforming from just a pack of blaster fodder to one of the most elite units in the Sith army. For his part, Dessel found that the life of a soldier suited him well. He was good at killing and surviving, and he discovered he also had a knack for inspiring the men and women under his command to fight their best. For once in his life, instead of being treated with hostility or mistrust or even fear, Dessel found himself being accepted, admired, and even loved by the men and women under his command. For the first time, he experienced such things as camaraderie and even friendship. He always did his best to get as many of his people in and out of battle alive as possible, taking every Gloomwalker killed in action as a personal failure. And it was because he self-evidently cared for their well-being and risked himself alongside them, the Gloomwalkers admired him even more. Ulabor may have been their official leader, but anyone with eyes to see could tell who it was they really fought for. It wasn't the grand destiny Dessel had imagined for himself back on Apatros, but it was a far sight better than life on that miserable ball of rock. For the first time in his life, he was actually happy, and had things gone differently, he might have been content to live out his life this way. But the dark side had plans for Dessel, and they did not include living and dying as a lowly ground pounder. Just as the fateful night at Groshik's Cantina had been the first turning point in Dessel's life, Fasira was the second. Fasira was a Republic manufacturing world with an important military base, a base that the Sith army wanted to attack. But first, they wanted the Gloomwalkers to take out an important outpost, depriving the base of the early warning that would allow the Sith to take them by surprise. Though the outpost was heavily guarded, with 3 repulsor craft armed with cannons, Ulabor was confident of an easy victory. Dessel was not so sure. His instincts were whispering that things were about to go bad. And they did, because Ulabor then received orders that the Gloomwalkers were to attack now, while it was still broad daylight. This was a terrible idea. Everyone knew it. It would be so much better to wait for the cover of darkness, delay both the raid on the outpost and the main offensive until then. But the order to attack now had come from one of the Brotherhood of Darkness, and Ulabor was too craven to even question the commands of his superiors. And so Dessel knocked Ulabor's lights out and took command. They couldn't defy orders, they'd be hunted down as traitors, but there was a chance, however slim, that they might be able to make this work. He ordered a message sent to Sith High Command informing them that the attack had already succeeded, and then had the Gloomwalkers wait until nightfall to make the attack on the outpost. If they hit hard and had luck on their side, they might be able to take the outpost in time to help the main assault. Not a single one of the Gloomwalkers went against Dessel's orders, even though they knew that this would almost certainly get them in some kind of trouble. Even with Dessel's preparations, the plan almost didn't work. The enemy position, bolstered by the 3 cannon-armed repulsor craft, was too strong. Even with the Gloomwalkers jamming their transmissions, the Republic forces put up a good fight. A miracle was needed. Then, Dessel was blinded by a flash grenade, and then provided the miracle. Still blinded, he grabbed a sniper rifle from Lucia, one of the younger Gloomwalkers, and despite having never used the weapon in his life, shot all 3 of the men manning the repulsor lift's cannons. With the artillery out of the way, the outpost was taken. A complete, if costly, victory. Dessel, however, did not have time to ruminate either on the losses the Gloomwalkers had suffered or his strange feat of accuracy. Upon returning to camp, it was discovered that Ulabor had regained consciousness and reported Dessel's insubordination to the Brotherhood of Darkness. Several enforcers had come to lead Bane away, presumably to court-martial and execution. The other Gloomwalkers were ready to tear Ulabor and the enforcers to pieces then and there, but Dessel restrained them. He knew that it wouldn't do them any good, the Sith would just hunt them all down anyway. And so, to spare his subordinates, Dessel accepted his fate. As he was led away, he looked at the Gloomwalkers one last time, and saw, though Ulabor didn't, the looks in their eyes. And so Dessel took some comfort in the fact that whatever happened to him, Lieutenant Ulabor was going to suffer a tragic and entirely fatal accident in the near future. After a few days cooling his heels in a holding cell, Dessel was finally brought to face his judge, Lord Kopesh, a Twi'lek Sith Lord and one of Khan's top lieutenants. And it turned out the Sith Lord was not here to judge or condemn Dessel, but to recruit him. For it was clear to Kopesh that Dessel was strong in the Force, and the Brotherhood of Darkness needed every Sith it could get its hands on. For a brief moment, Dessel hesitated, reluctant to leave behind the Gloomwalkers. They were utterly devoted to him. Had he consented to it, they would have fought and died for him. But in the end, they wouldn't have been able to save him had this really been a court-martial and execution. And he remembered Groshik's last bit of advice before leaving Apatros. In the end, you are the only one you can count on. Good intentions mean nothing without strength. Nothing is more important than power. Dessel had always understood that. And so, he accepted Kopesh's offer and started on the path to becoming an entirely new man. To commemorate this, he took a new name. He would take the curse his alcoholic father had always hurled at him and make it the source of his strength. Ever after, he would be Bane of the Sith. From there, it was off to an old familiar set of stomping grounds for fans of Star Wars, the Sith Academy on Korriban. Despite starting out later than the usual Sith hopefuls at the Academy, Bane thrived in the hyper-competitive environment of Sith apprentices vying for the attention and training of their masters. Everybody received general lessons, but if you really wanted to get a head start, you wanted personal one-on-one instruction. Lord Cordis, a human Sith Lord, tall and rail-thin with a fondness for jewels, was headmaster of the academy, as well as one of Lord Khan's top lieutenants. The only other instructor mentioned at all in the book was Kasim, the Twi'lek blade master who instructed the students in lightsaber combat. As his education progressed at the academy, Bane's hunger for power grew. When he wasn't learning from the masters, he sat in the Sith archives beneath the academy and read the scrolls of the ancient Sith, absorbing the teachings and black wisdom of every great Sith Lord that had come before. This despite the fact that the masters generally dismissed the scrolls. Oh, they collected them, if only to keep them out of the hands of the Jedi, but as far as Cordis and the other masters of the academy were concerned, there was very little of value to learn from the old Sith. After all, the old ways had resulted in nothing but failure after failure at the hands of the Jedi. This was why Khan had formed the Brotherhood of Darkness as he had, as ostensibly a community of equals. Yes, competition did make the Sith strong, but taken too far, such competition would degenerate into the murderous infighting that had brought down so many in the past. For the most part, Bane had accepted this reasoning, but there was always a small part of him that questioned this. But as time went by, he more and more dedicated himself to the instruction of the masters, and less to the ancient writings. Like any good Sith, ambition burned within him, and he wanted to be top dog of the academy. At the moment, that position was occupied by a talented Zabrak named Sirak. However, Bane knew he wasn't yet ready to challenge him, but there was someone more within his reach. And so one day, after the morning lightsaber lessons with Kasim, Bane challenged Foharg to a duel. Foharg was a Makurth. Imagine a Trandoshan with 4 horns and you're in the right ballpark. It was common and perfectly acceptable for Sith students to challenge one another to single combat, so long as there were people, especially instructors, to witness it, and they avoided fatalities as often as possible. After all, the Brotherhood needed every Sith that it could get, and so could ill afford to lose them to literal duels to the death. At first, it seemed as if Bane had miscalculated his chances, for Foharg proved more skilled than he, beating Bane severely and then mocking him for his weakness. But in that moment on the precipice of defeat, Bane tapped into his rage, always an easy route to the power of the dark side, and with a surge of dark side energy, killed Foharg, despite Kasim's injunction to stop. Though in fairness, the Blade Master didn't really do anything to intervene beyond commanding Bane to stop. After all, if Foharg was so weak as to not be able to resist Bane's assault, then he really wasn't worth the time. Still, killing is a big no-no at the Korriban Academy, and so Bane got a stern telling off for his actions. But no more than that. Unfortunately, killing Foharg opened up a door inside of Bane's memory that he hadn't realized before. The night after the duel, he dreamed about the last night he'd spent with his father, before his death. Hurst had been especially cruel and had beaten him especially badly, cracking a few ribs among other things. And that night, as Dessel had lain on his cot, he had hated his father and thought about him dying. Had imagined a great hand closing about his father's evil heart and squishing it. The next morning, Hurst was found dead of a heart attack. The authorities on Apatros had chalked it up to strain, a combination of Hurst's alcoholism and the exertion of beating his son half to death. But now the connection was made, and Bane realized the truth. He had, however unknowingly, killed his father. And that realization shook something inside of him. In his previous life, Dessel had been angry, brooding, sullen, not a pleasant man, but no one would have ever described him as cruel. None would have really thought him the kind of person that would do something like that. But cruelty is definitely something that the Sith do. After all, Bane had had Foharg beaten, and yet he chose to kill him anyway, even though the fight was won. And so, inside Bane's psyche, the tiny remnant of Dessel, the man he had once been, rebelled against Bane, the man he was becoming. In the days and weeks that followed, despite receiving more attention from the instructors, Bane found that he could no longer draw upon the dark side. He could not work up the anger and hatred needed to unleash its power. Where once he'd been a rising star in the academy, now he began to fall behind. After his killing of Foharg, most of the students, particularly those weaker than him, had begun to fear him. But the more time passed, the more obvious Bane's decline in power became. It wouldn't be long before even those who wouldn't have challenged him pre-Foharg would be ready to take a piece out of him. And of course, if he ceased improving, the instructors would stop spending time on him. At last, Bane resorted to the one thing that he thought might help him climb out of this rut. He challenged Sirak. Perhaps he hoped that the high stakes of fighting for his life against the Academy's top student would give him the desperate strength needed to finally reconnect to the dark side. If that was his hope, it was very quickly shattered. Not only could he not reconnect to the dark side, but Sirak by this point realized just how weak he'd become. He beat Bane within an inch of his life, half crippled him, but such was the Zabrak's contempt for Bane at this point that he decided the human wasn't worth killing. When Bane woke up, he was in a healing tank. His body was on the mend, but his spirit was all but broken. His prospects at becoming a great Sith Lord had been shattered. He was now beneath the contempt of just about every student at the Sith Academy. The instructors would have nothing to do with him outside of the general lessons, partly due to his obvious weakness, but partly, as Blade Master Kasim discovered, because Headmaster Cortus had deliberately ordered them not to. For all Khan's idea that the Brotherhood of Darkness should be a brotherhood, a community of equals, the dark side urge to power and rivalry remained strong among the Sith, and Cortus was a rival of Khopesh, the Twi'lek Sith Lord that had discovered Bane. Thus, the headmaster was happy to see Bane fall because it might reflect badly on his rival. And so, as Bane trudged through this new purgatory that his life had become, he found that the only teachers still willing to give him any time of day were the words of the ancient Sith. And so he spent nearly all his free time in the archives, poring over the old wisdom. Perhaps they might help him find a way back to the dark side. Alas, he could find no answers there, but the more he read, the more he found himself beginning to question the foundations upon which the Brotherhood had been established. The more he began to think that Khan's solution to the problem of Sith rivalry was wrong. But as I said earlier, the dark side had plans for Bane, and so, at this, his lowest ebb, it threw him a lifeline in the form of a young renegade Jedi named Githany. Tall, seductively beautiful, black-haired, and green-eyed, this lady is pretty much the poster girl for the wicked but beautiful daughter section of the evil overlord list. She'd left the Jedi Order mostly because she was caught having an affair with a fellow apprentice, Keel Charney. Their master gave the ultimatum, leave the Jedi Order or stop being together. Githany, who'd always cared more about power than philosophy, had left. She'd even asked Charney to go with her, but he'd chosen the Jedi over her. Naturally, being the ambitious, power-hungry woman that she was, Githany's personal mission statement on arriving on Korriban was to topple Sirak from his position as top student, but knew that at this point she was no match for him in terms of power. She decided that she would need an ally, someone she could easily manipulate and control. Bane seemed the perfect candidate. And so, putting on her most seductive smile, she'd approached Bane with an offer. She would help him try to regain his connection to the dark side, and he would help her against Sirak. Bane didn't need much persuasion. Githany was beautiful, plus he really wanted to get back at Sirak for what he'd done. But of course, Bane wasn't so taken in that he didn't know from the start Githany was essentially using him. Well, two could play that game. And so even as Githany began teaching him how to reconnect to the dark side, as well as passing on the lessons the instructors at the academy had given her, Bane sought out the one teacher that might be in any way inclined to help him, Kasim the Blade Master. With some persuasion, the Twi'lek agreed to secretly train Bane in lightsaber combat despite Headmaster Cordis's prohibition. And Bane kept this a secret from Githany, even as he concealed his secret lessons with her from Kasim. Also, he continued to study the ancient Sith texts, although Githany saw no real value in them, which only served to fuel his suspicion that Khan's way was the wrong way. The dark side is all about accruing power, about asserting dominance. And yet, Khan had established this idea of equality with the Brotherhood, something that flew in the face of the most basic precepts of the Sith philosophy. As an example, Khan had outlawed the use of the title Darth, for it was an honorific that claimed preeminence and superiority, which Khan reasoned would lead to jealousy and infighting and thus bring the Brotherhood down. The reasoning was sound, and yet Bane couldn't shake the feeling that this was profoundly counter to everything the dark side was supposed to be about. Meanwhile, as their secret lessons together progressed, Githany and Bane began to realize that they might actually feel something for one another. In fairness, they did have quite a lot in common. They were both ambitious, they hungered for power and domination, they both disdained the weak. But Githany found these growing feelings for Bane increasingly disturbing. Her relationship with Keel Charney had been a purely physical one. With Bane, it was different, and not the kind of different that she liked. She'd intended, of course, to make Bane feel for her because that gave her control over him. But if she was reciprocating his feelings, that meant he also had some control over her. And Githany was the kind of woman who did not like not being completely in control of things. Her worries only grew when she finally helped Bane reconnect with the dark side and his latent power began to outstrip hers. She began to worry about just how much longer she could control Bane, if she even could anymore. And here is where I have my one singular criticism with the Darth Bane trilogy, the thing that keeps it from being on the same level as the Thrawn trilogy. Karpyshyn does dedicate enough time to build the relationship between Githany and Bane, which makes sense, but here I think he kind of missed a trick. He doesn't really dedicate any time to Bane reconnecting with the dark side. He doesn't really show Bane struggling with the guilt that is the main hindrance to his connection to the dark side. Githany just tells him that she knows a way to restore his power, gives a brief demonstration where she helps him reconnect to the Force for a little while, then a brief time skip later he's essentially back to his old self again. This would be a great opportunity to develop Bane's character arc. And if that made it too much for one book, then Karpyshyn, I think, should have just split Path of Destruction into two. The first focusing on Bane reconnecting to the dark side, and the second focusing on the Battle of Ruusan. Make it a Bane tetralogy instead of a Bane trilogy, because as far as I'm concerned, more Karpyshyn Star Wars is generally good Star Wars. And so, his strength fully restored, Bane challenged Sirak. However, it wasn't enough for the human to just beat the Zabrak. He wanted to humiliate Sirak just as he had been. Bane had studied his enemy in preparation for this moment, and he knew by now that while Sirak was really good, incredibly strong and very fast, the Zabrak lacked stamina. And so Bane deliberately dragged out the first phase of the duel, pretending to still be weak enough that Sirak was confident of victory, but just strong enough that Sirak couldn't beat him quickly. And so the fight had dragged on. Sirak became more exhausted and frustrated, and as a consequence, sloppy. And then, at the right moment where his frustration was beginning to slide into despair, Bane unleashed his full power and broke the Zabrak. Just as Sirak had broken him. Also, like Sirak, Bane decided to let his beaten foe live. Let him know the same humiliation and despair that Bane had known. Afterwards, Kasim congratulated his disciple on his great victory and presented him with a gift, a lightsaber with a curved hilt, a style that would be favored centuries later by Count Dooku. The saber had originally belonged to Kasim's mentor, whom the Blade Master had killed as a way of proving to himself that he had surpassed the old man. That story left an impression on Bane, more on that later. But where Kasim praised him, Githany responded less well. In her eyes, Bane's decision to spare Sirac betrayed weakness. And Githany really did not like weakness. As if falling out with his sort of girlfriend wasn't enough, Bane was then called out on the metaphorical carpet by Headmaster Cordis, who revealed that he'd known all along about Bane's secret training, and now expressly forbade him from associating with Githany and from studying the Sith archives. In response to that, Bane cut loose, denouncing Cordis and all the other instructors, apart from Kasim, who had essentially abandoned him after his first defeat at the hands of Sirac. The wisdom of the ancient Sith had taught him far more than they ever had, and they had convinced him that Khan's Brotherhood was a perversion of the true ways of the Sith, and he would prove it by going to the Valley of Tombs to consult the spirits of the ancient Sith. But when he reached the tombs, there was only silence. No matter how many entreaties he made, no matter how much he reached out with the dark side, Bane received no response. But rather than dampen his convictions, they only served to strengthen him. In his mind, the ancient spirits of the long-dead Sith had abandoned Korriban because, like him, they too viewed Khan's Brotherhood as unworthy. From that point on, Bane was convinced that it was his mission to find the true way of the dark side and restore the Sith to what they once were. But he still needed information, and he believed that he would find it on a world that, unlike Korriban, still pulsed with the living power of the dark side. After another long, weary journey across the desert of Korriban, Bane returned to the academy, just in time for Githany to lure him into a trap that she and Sirac had set up. Convinced of Bane's weakness by his failure to kill Sirac in the duel, Githany had decided to eliminate the man whom she now saw as a greater threat than the Zabrak had been. But when it finally came down to it, Githany couldn't quite bring herself to kill the man that she maybe kinda loved in a weird, twisted, dark side way. And so she double-crossed Sirac at the last minute, killing two of his lackeys while Bane had his rival at his mercy. And this time, Bane decided to show none. When Sirac begged to be spared, promising to serve Bane, the human replied, "Those who ask for mercy are too weak to deserve it." So perished Sirac. It's a good culminating moment, but again, it would have been better if Karpyshyn had developed Bane's inner struggle more earlier in the book. Bane did not waste any time reveling in this final victory over Sirac. While the other Academy students were being elevated to full membership of the Brotherhood of Darkness, each being given the title of Lord, and being summoned to the mid-rim world of Ruusan to contend against the Jedi, Bane denounced all of this as folly and a perversion of the dark side. Let Khan and his lackeys fight their petty war. Bane, now calling himself Darth Bane, had a greater destiny in mind, the restoration of the true Sith. And just like that, he stormed out, brazenly stole Cordis's personal ship, and took off for parts unknown. While all this was going on, though few knew it at the time, the new Sith Wars were finally reaching its conclusion. In response to Khan's Brotherhood of Darkness, an army of militant Jedi calling themselves the Army of Light had arisen in opposition, led by the Jedi Lord Hoth. The rivalry between the two leaders had increased as time went by, both men increasingly viewing the conflict not as simply one of conquest, but one of light versus dark for final domination of the galaxy. Knowing that Khan was obsessed with destroying him, Hoth decided to take advantage of this by luring Khan's attention towards the small mid-rim world of Ruusan. Originally a pleasant world of forests and plains, inhabited by settlers and strange, gentle telepaths known as Bouncers, the resulting campaign between the Brotherhood of Darkness and the Army of Light served to ravage the planet. Especially as time wore on and both sides began pouring more and more fighting forces into the conflict. But while Khan had the almost total loyalty of the Brotherhood, Lord Hoth had begun to alienate many members of the Jedi Council with his militant ways. Some expressed the fear that his obsession with Khan might well lead him to the dark side. As the war against the Sith on Ruusan dragged on, Hoth desperately needed reinforcements. And so at last, one of his top lieutenants, the annoyingly flamboyant Valentine Farfalla, offered to go and recruit people willing to help the Army of Light. While Lord Hoth himself was brave and courageous, an inspirational figure that made others want to follow him, he was also very blunt and abrasive, and the years of war against the Sith had embittered him. Farfalla, by contrast, was smooth and personable. He had a far better chance of persuading people, including the Jedi Council, to support the Army of Light. Despite his personal dislike of Farfalla, Hoth grudgingly acceded to his plan, mostly after some persuasion by his other lieutenant and close friend, Pernikar. And so the fighting had dragged on for a total of 2 years, both sides pouring more and more forces into the Ruusan campaign even as the fighting bled each other dry. One might have thought that it was the currents of the Force guiding the champions of the light and the dark to this final reckoning. As the Army of Light became increasingly outnumbered, Hoth switched tactics from open confrontation to a guerrilla campaign. But even as the Sith were gaining the upper hand on Ruusan, they began to lose everywhere else in the galaxy, as Khan, so focused on Ruusan, left sectors undefended for the Republic to reclaim. It was around this time that the new recruits, the former students of Korriban Academy, were brought to Ruusan to bolster the Brotherhood. From Githany, Khan learned of Bane's defection and of the immense power the young human wielded. Khan could ill afford to let such a powerful dark side adept run free. What's more, Githany had recently had a Force vision that foretold Bane's destruction of the Brotherhood. Now convinced that the younger man was a threat, Khan decided to send someone to assassinate him. He chose Kasim the Blade Master. Despite the fact that the Twi'lek had had some fondness for Bane, his best pupil, Khan was able to persuade him to carry out his task by using a combination of arguments and subtle mind manipulation, making Kasim think that Bane's defection from the Brotherhood was a personal insult to him. Fortunately, Githany's vision had told her where Bane would be, so it's not like Kasim had to look very hard for him. Bane had indeed, in the interim, found what he was looking for. The world was called Lehon, or the Unknown World, but in reality, it was Rakata Prime. And although the Sith Empire of Revan and Malak was millennia dead and the Starforge long destroyed, it seemed the Republic had gone to great pains to conceal the existence of the planet, even giving it different names. The Rakata, an ancient race of Force-sensitive, mostly cannibalistic warlords, had once ruled over the whole galaxy in ancient times. But after a plague that wiped out most of their population and stripped the remainder of their connection to the Force, they had declined and by Bane's time were well and truly extinct. But the past does not die so easily, and amid the jungle ruins, Bane found a holocron left behind by Revan, back when he'd been Darth Revan of the Sith. For weeks, Bane absorbed the information left behind, and it confirmed everything that he'd believed about the Sith and about the folly of the Brotherhood of Darkness. The nature of the dark side is to seek power, and to accrue it to oneself. Strength before anything. It was the natural order of things, and yet every time a great Sith Lord had arisen, his efforts had ultimately failed. Inevitably, his followers would seek to betray him and destroy what he had built. Khan had recognized the problem correctly, but he had come to the wrong conclusion. He tried to suppress the urge to power and backstabbing by fostering these ideas of equality and cooperation. But this was all wrong. The Sith had failed every time because they had tried to fight like the Jedi, who could always be relied on to cooperate and work together in the name of fighting evil. But where the Jedi drew strength from their numbers and their unity, the Sith, in trying to grow their own numbers, diluted themselves. And so it was at last that Bane's convictions finally crystallized into the iconic Rule of Two, his vision for the Sith Order. No more armies, no more hordes of acolytes. There would only be one master and one apprentice, one to embody the power, the other to crave it. The master must take no more than one apprentice, for even if the apprentices are all weaker than him individually, they could gang up to destroy him despite their weakness. By limiting the apprentices to only one, the master ensured that if the apprentice destroyed him, it was because he or she was better. And though the Sith Master must hold on to power for as long as he can, he must accept that one day he will be surpassed. Only thus could the Sith maintain their strength, ensuring that each generation would be stronger than the one before. And it was around here that Kasim caught up with his former student. Bane had grown strong in the Force, and his swordsmanship skills were greatly improved, but Kasim was a master. And even when Bane thought he might be gaining the upper hand on his former teacher, Kasim pulled a trump card. The Twi'lek had always favored a double-bladed lightsaber, although he had taught his students in various forms of combat, except for the use of dual wielding. The Blade Master had always dismissed such a fighting style as foolish, but then he split his double-bladed lightsaber into a pair, and it turns out his refusal to teach his students dual wielding had all been a ruse. Now Bane not only had to contend with Kasim's superior skill, he now had to contend with a fighting style that he was completely unfamiliar with. But laser swords are not a Sith's only weapon. Though Bane couldn't beat Kasim in a sword fight, he was able to use the Force to bring the temple the two were fighting in crashing down on the Twi'lek, crushing him to death. Bane shed no tears over Kasim's end. By this point, he knew that his ultimate mission would involve destroying the Brotherhood. Might as well get started early. Back on Ruusan, Khan received an unexpected message from Bane, informing him of Kasim's death, but that he might be willing to reconsider joining the Brotherhood. He wanted Khan to send an emissary to meet him on the world of Ambria. Khan, determined to eliminate the threat that Bane represented more than ever, decided that Githany should be his second assassin. Her former relationship with Bane might let her get past his guard. But despite her genuine loyalty to Khan, Githany had mixed feelings about this, because try as she might, she couldn't deny her attraction to Bane. And so she met with Bane on Ambria, near the shores of Lake Nath, a bleak and terrible locus of dark side power. Long, long ago, the machinations of an ancient Sith Lord had left the entire planet tainted. The T'Chukthai Jedi Master Thawne from Tales of the Jedi had attempted to cleanse the world of the taint of the dark side, but in the end could not eliminate it entirely. The best he'd been able to do was contain the dark side within the bounds of the lake. Both Bane and Githany went into their little meeting with each other warily. Githany, for her part, was determined that whatever her feelings for Bane might be, her ultimate loyalty lay with Khan. As for Bane, now that he had his Rule of Two doctrine, he needed an apprentice to his master. And, because of his feelings for Githany, he really, really wanted her to be the one. But though she did have the ambition, and privately admitted to Bane that she wasn't taken in by Khan's notion of equality among the Brotherhood, Bane got the feeling that she never really understood what he was doing or why he believed what he did, even when he tried to explain it to her. Not that that stopped them from sharing some passionate kisses, and instantly Bane tasted the poison that Githany had smeared on her lips. He was almost disappointed when she left, mostly because the poison was just too obvious. Like the Jedi, Sith can use the Force to purge toxins from their bodies. After Kasim, this attempt on his life seemed disappointing, and that's when the second tasteless poison kicked in. The obvious poison had just been there to lull him into a sense of false security. By the time Bane realized what was happening, the poison was too entrenched in his system to be purged. He actually laughed, both in appreciation of Githany's cunning and at himself for his folly. Then the pain really kicked in, and there was no room for mirth. The Force, for all its power, could not help him here. What Bane needed was an old-fashioned healer. Until he could find one, the best he could do was draw upon the latent dark side power from Lake Nath. But as the toxin progressed, even that wasn't enough to keep him alive. Luckily for Bane, he stumbled upon a group of scavengers, a father and his children, salvaging what they could from the wreckage of an ancient battlefield. Bane proceeded to kill the children one by one in front of their father so that their pain and fear could fuel him and keep the poison at bay. Then he killed the father. At last, with the help of the scavenger's vehicle, Bane was able to find the man he sought. Alas, Star Wars is not brutal legend, so it's not like Bane could find the Killmaster and receive the healing energies of a smooth heavy metal bassline, but Ambria did have the next best thing. A man named Caleb, a very powerful healer who had his own unusual connection to the Force. Not light or dark, but he drew his strength rather from the planet itself, from the forces of nature. He was a man who simply wanted to help others. To his mind, the Jedi versus the Sith was just folly, and so had refused to support either side in the war. Of course, Caleb immediately sensed the immense evil within Bane, dying though he was, and refused to help him. He then half-boiled his own hand just to demonstrate to the Sith Lord that he could not be compelled to help him. Not by torture, not by intimidation. For a moment, Bane was actually at a loss. If he couldn't persuade Caleb to help him, he was going to die. But all that a Sith has to persuade are fear and pain, and Caleb had made it clear that neither would work on him. But then, through the pain that was consuming him, Bane reached out with the Force and sensed there was another in the small camp, Caleb's one weakness, his daughter, whom the healer had tried to hide. For Bane, it was simplicity itself, even in his current state, to simply force lift the girl out of the hut and suspend her over Caleb's own soup pot. At last, the healer caved and agreed to heal Bane. Afterwards, Bane considered killing the healer, but decided that he might be useful in the future, and so simply departed for Ruusan. Needless to say, Khan, Githany, and the Brotherhood were shocked when Bane casually walked in on their council of war. But for now, he seemed willing to help them fight the Jedi, the attempts on his life notwithstanding. But he made no secret of his disdain for Khan. When the Brotherhood's leader began speaking of tactics and deployment of forces, Bane scoffed. "You're thinking like a dirt general, not a Sith Lord." Really do like that line. And so Bane proposed his own idea. Lord Hoth and the Army of Light were hiding in one of Ruusan's forests. Bane's solution? Burn the whole thing down with a massive dark side ritual. Only a premonition through the Force to Lord Hoth saved the Army of Light from complete eradication, as the forest they were sheltering in exploded in a wave of fiery destruction. Even then, Bane might have actually succeeded in wiping the Jedi out, except Khan broke the ritual before it was complete. As Bane watched in furious outrage, Khan then commanded the Brotherhood to fight the Jedi the old-fashioned way with a speeder bike attack. And every last one of those fools eagerly obeyed him, even Githany. And with that, despite what Bane felt for her, he knew now that she was unworthy of his vision for the Sith. And so he decided to set Plan A in motion. While everybody else was off to get their kicks, he returned to camp. Cordus actually waylaid Bane and offered to join him in overthrowing Khan, only for Bane to just laugh and kill the former headmaster in contempt. After all, he wasn't here to take over the Brotherhood. And then contacted the commander of the Sith fleet orbiting Ruusan and ordered them to engage the Jedi fleet. Since nobody dared disagree with a member of the Brotherhood, the commander had no choice but to obey. The attack resulted in a lot of casualties, but more importantly, allowed the Jedi reinforcements that Farfalla had finally brought with him to make planetfall. The sudden reinforcements drove the Sith back, but Lord Hoth was in no mood to be grateful to Farfalla. Pernacar, his advisor and arguably oldest friend, was among the casualties. Consumed by anger and grief, Hoth essentially exploded at Farfalla and told him to take his reinforcements and go away, which the offended Farfalla proceeded to do. Luckily for the Jedi, Khan was in no position to take advantage of the division within their ranks. The Sith fleet had suffered significant losses in their duel with the Republic equivalent, and Farfalla's reinforcements had taken the Sith by surprise, inflicting heavy casualties in the ground battle. Now, Khan believed that there was only one option left to him. When Bane had sent that original proposal to rejoin the Brotherhood from Ambria, he had also sent a peace offering, the workings of another powerful and deadly Sith ritual called the Thought Bomb. Initially, Khan had rejected the idea as too dangerous, but now there seemed to be no other option for him. Not if he wanted to finally win against Lord Hoth. Just to make matters worse, Bane confronted Khan and basically admitted to orchestrating the whole thing. And after that business with the ritual, Khan knew that Bane far outstripped him in connection to the dark side. But Khan was desperate to hold on to his power, and so resorted to what had always been his greatest strength, mental manipulation. And at first it seemed to work. He seemed to have convinced Bane that there was no way the Brotherhood would accept him if he tried to replace Khan as its leader, especially not if his recent treachery was exposed. Khan was the only person that could protect Bane now, and so he sent the younger man away, determined to destroy him with the full might of the Brotherhood after he'd used the thought bomb to destroy the Jedi. Of course, it hadn't really worked. Bane had just played along, pretending to fall under Khan's manipulation. His plan was working perfectly. Khan was committed to using the thought bomb, because, according to the scroll that Bane had sent him, while the thought bomb would consume the essence of any Force user within its blast radius, it could be survived if the user was strong enough. But in reality, that was a lie. The thought bomb was not a desperation play, it was a suicide play. And thanks to Bane's machinations, Khan was now convinced that the thought bomb was his only way out. In reality, he was simply sealing his fate and that of the Brotherhood. All Bane had to do now was put some distance between himself and what was about to happen, and wait. Consumed by desperation bordering on madness, Khan brought the remaining members of the Brotherhood of Darkness down into a series of caves. There they began the ritual that would create the thought bomb. Only Khopesh, the Twi'lek Sith Lord that had first recruited Bane for the Brotherhood, refused to take part, slipping away when no one was looking. Despite her own misgivings, Githany was initially in on the ritual. But as it commenced, she began to realize what was happening and for the first time recognized the growing madness of Khan. Despite the pull of the ritual compelling her to merge her power and will with that of the others, Githany managed to break free and stagger away into the caves, only to get herself lost in its twisting maze. Back in the encampment of the Army of Light, things were pretty miserable. The destruction wrought by Bane's ritual had been so devastating, it had driven the local bouncers mad. Where once the gentle aliens had used their native telepathy to soothe and ease the suffering of the injured, now the maddened creatures began projecting into the minds of all those around them visions of pain and suffering. The Jedi had been forced to kill any bouncers on sight in order to protect themselves. At first, though, despite everything, Hoth's pride refused to bend. But at last, a dream visitation by the spirit of Pernikar, his old friend, finally convinced the Jedi leader to swallow his pride and reconcile with Farfalla. Finally, with a new sense of unity and purpose, the Army of Light began the final push against the Sith. To their confusion, they found plenty of mooks and foot soldiers to fight, but no Dark Lords, save one, Khopesh. Convinced that the Sith cause was lost, and that what Khan had in store was worse than death, Khopesh had only one desire left now. He wanted to die fighting. And he did get his wish, extracting a duel to the death from Farfalla in exchange for revealing the existence of the thought bomb. And so, at the 11th hour, Hoth faced a dilemma. Khan and the Brotherhood couldn't simply be left alone. They would just decamp and maybe use the thought bomb somewhere else. And yet to confront the Lord of the Brotherhood now would mean certain death. And while Hoth would happily have sacrificed his own life for the sake of the galaxy, he knew that he couldn't just go alone. He needed to bring enough with him to threaten Khan into using the thought bomb then and there. And that would mean leading many good men and women to their deaths. In fact, to fates worse than death. But with the entire Brotherhood of Darkness gathered in one place, every last Sith, that sacrifice might be worth it if it meant destroying them for good. Hoth explained the situation to his followers, stressing that this final mission was a suicide mission and that he would only accept volunteers. But such was the love and loyalty that the Jedi had for him that every member of the army volunteered. and so he had to make the painful decision of who was to go with him to die. Farfalla was explicitly excluded, for Hoth believed that at least some leader of the Army of Light must go back to tell the galaxy of what was happening this day. And so, once the rest of the Army of Light had moved a safe distance away, the 100 doomed Jedi, Hoth in the lead, descended into the caves. Confronted by his old enemy, Khan did indeed detonate the thought bomb, and in an instant, all Jedi and Sith within the main chamber were consumed. Githany, some distance away but not far enough, got to experience the horrible sensation of feeling her life force being sucked out of her before she too succumbed. And so, all the Jedi and Sith were destroyed, their souls imprisoned in eternal torment and agony for all time. Or at least for 1,000 years until Kyle Katarn finally released them in 5 ABY. Safely miles away, the Army of Light felt the disturbance in the Force and wept at the death of their comrades. Miles away in the other direction, Bane too sensed the disturbance and smiled. His plan was complete. The Brotherhood of Darkness was gone. As far as the Republic was concerned, the Sith were extinct. Now he was free to remake the Order in accordance with the vision of the Rule of Two. But he still needed an apprentice. But, as had been so often the case throughout his life, the dark side saw fit to provide. As he made his way back to the Valsian, the ship he'd taken from Cordis on Korriban, Bane found a little blonde girl, her mind roiling with fear, grief, and hatred, weeping beside the body of a slain bouncer. Nearby were 2 Jedi, their necks snapped in a way that could only have been done with the Force. "Do you know who I am? You're a Sith. You're not afraid of me? No. I have killed many people. Men, women, even children. I'm a killer too. Do you know the ways of the Force? Do you understand the true nature of the dark side? No, but you can teach me. I'm young. I will learn."